Hello, everybody. My name is Jackie Jones. I'm Superintendent of Community Affairs for Metro Parks, and we are absolutely thrilled to have you all with us to help develop a master plan for Fort Negley. But first and foremost, Fort Negley is a cultural landscape that helps us determine who we are, not just as a city, but as a nation. And one thing that we want you to know is that we consider Fort Negley sacred and an irreplaceable public open space. Now, we've been working for a couple of months now with our consulting team led by HDLA Landscape Architects. The team includes historians, naturalists, and other professionals. Now, so far, we've been focusing on data collection and site analysis, but that phase ends tonight because this is our very first public input meeting. Now, over the course of the next couple of months, we'll be coming to you again to get your input, insight, concerns, and aspirations for the fort. Now, tonight's agenda is broken into two phases. Phase one is a panel of 4 experts on Fort Negley. And then phase two is after the discussion, we'll move to the lobby where we will have different stations set up to get your opinions and ideas about the fort. And we'll attempt to wrap things up maybe around 7:30 or so. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris Cotton. Chris is the immediate past chair of the Friends of Fort Negley and will serve as moderator for tonight's discussion. Chris?
Thank you, Jackie. First of all, I just wanted to thank Metro Parks and the Metro Historical Commission for their work in bringing this master planning process to fruition. It's been a long time coming. We're all very excited, and we're so thankful for their leadership in this process. You guys are in for a treat right now. We have with us 4 people who I get to work with quite a bit and who I'm very lucky to call friends, but who are just a vast knowledge of all things Fort Negley. And I personally have learned so much from these 4 people, and hopefully in these next, 4.5 hours I think we have, is that right? They're historians, they like to talk. We'll, maybe not, maybe 45 minutes. In the next 45 minutes, we'll get to share with you some of the things that make Fort Negley special. And so we're going to do this as a conversation. This is going to be probably a little challenging as I'm going to be shuttling the microphone back and forth a little bit. But first, let me introduce everyone. Dr. Leah Rotha Williams, Professor of History at Tennessee State University, who is also a member of the HDLA's Master Planning Team. Dr. Carol Busey. Dr. Busey is a Davidson County historian and a professor of history at Volunteer State Community College. Krista Castillo. Krista is a Metro Parks facility manager, and if you're ever at Fort Negley, you will usually see her shining face, or Tracy, who's also sitting in the back. So, finally, Gary Burke. Gary was one of the founding members of the Friends of Fort Negley group and is again a current board member as of last week, and is also a member of the 13th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops Living History Association. And Gary also has a very personal tie to Fort Negley I'll let him tell you about in a moment. But first of all, my first question to you guys. You've all been involved in various capacities with Fort Negley, professionally, personally, or both, for a really long time. What is it about Fort Negley that really resonates most with you? Who wants to go first?
Thank you, Chris. What really resonates with me about Fort Negley is the vast history that surrounds Fort Negley. I was walking around Fort Negley before this meeting tonight, kind of getting the feel of the ancestors as I walked amongst their spirit. And it's hard to believe that next year it'll be 160 years that the fort was built by the laborers who built it, the 2,771 laborers. And so I get a passionate feeling about them to be remembered because they were forgotten for so long. But now we have the opportunity to give them a voice from the past. And so I'm glad to be a part of that.
Thank you, Gary. I think what resonates most with me is that Fort Negley's story is so complicated and multi-dimensional, and it's so many things all at once that can't be fit into a neat little box. It's a Civil War site, but it's a site of emancipation. It's a site of oppression, but it's also a site of freedom. Um, it's There are tragic stories. There are hopeful stories. I was saying earlier that these questions are more like essay questions. I don't really know how to distill it down, but I think the main thing is Fort Negley is slowly revealing its secrets. We don't know everything about the site yet. There's so much more to learn and discover. And this master plan, I hope, will give us the opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Krista. I think that the history of the whole area surrounding Fort Negley and the fort itself is really a part of Nashville history that has often been overlooked. Since in recent memory, we can only remember that area with the interstate highway being sort of a boundary in there. We don't recognize that that was a thriving neighborhood and community both before and after the Civil War. And so to think about the people who were living around that when the fort was being built, to be living around that when the Civil War ended, it was an interesting neighborhood in that it actually incorporated into its own little incorporated town called South Nashville in 1850. It only stayed incorporated for 4 years and then it merged into the city of Nashville. But it had a robust and independent spirit in the neighborhood. It was largely a working community as opposed to the people who were living in the city on what I would call the other side of perhaps the Korean Veterans Boulevard there. That was kind of the boundary between South Nashville and Nashville. And so I think it's important that we include all of our neighborhoods in the discussion of what Nashville's history means. And as Krista said, the multiple layers that are still there for us to just peel back one at a time, that is what is so exciting to see new history being discovered every week.
First, I want to say good evening to everyone. As a historian of African American history, one of the things that really animates my work is, the period of time in which African Americans make the transition from enslaved to free people. It's oftentimes a story that has gone undertold, if that's a word, right? Then when it was told, it was misrepresented. It was always through the lens of people who oftentimes really didn't see us as human beings, see us as equal, see us as worthy. Fort Negley, in my mind, gives us an opportunity to reclaim that narrative, whether it's via history or culture or whatever the case may be. We now have an opportunity to attempt to make right an injustice that occurred more than 160 years ago. And it also has pushed me as a historian to, think a bit differently about what I see when I see a historical fort, right, a Civil War fort. I've had the opportunity to visit a lot of forts, and I've found that, oftentimes black communities emerge right outside of these spaces, and they have histories, right? And in the big scheme of things, the Civil War, at least in this city, lasted, well, actually, to be honest, it lasted about a year, right? Before the city was rescued from the Confederacy. But at best, let's say the Civil War lasted 4 years. Reconstruction lasted 3 times that amount of time. And then when I was studying to become a historian, my professor suggested that I look at Civil War and Reconstruction as one story, because at the end of the day, you have the same number of players being involved in it. So for me, Fort Negley is important because it gives us an opportunity to reevaluate its history. But more important, with its recent designation as a UNESCO site, a site of memory, I can link the history of Fort Negley back to when the Portuguese first came to Africa and decided to kidnap Africans and enslave them. So I'm sorry I went a little bit long, but that's why it's important to me.
Don't make us get out the hook, Lee. Um, all right, here's a challenging one. Maybe not in the question itself, but because you guys knew so much. What is the one thing about Fort Negley that you wish the folks in this room knew? The one thing.
I think that one of the most important things about Fort Negley is everybody in this room knows about it now, but it hasn't always been that way. We haven't always had a truly honest telling of the story of our history, and many important parts have been left out. And I think that this part of the history, as painful as some parts of it may be, from the enslaved workers building parts of the fort to Klan rallies up there and cross burnings in the 1920s, mind you, not in the 1860s. I think that is a part of our history that we must be honest about, and we must try to make it as inclusive as possible rather than just focusing on the one single thing of the Civil War.
There are many things that I would like everyone in this room to know. But I think the main thing is that Fort Negley is not limited to the stonework at the top of the hill. Fort Negley was the nucleus of a much larger complex that involved entrenchments, thousands of soldiers, thousands of laborers that all had to live somewhere during the occupation of the fort. So it's not just this 4 acres of stonework that remains today. It's everything that would have radiated out from it. The soldiers' camps, entrenchments, supply stores, privies, the road system that was used to access the fort, the railway system, the sawmill that was located across Chestnut Street, where Vanderbilt now has a parking lot. And that we shouldn't assume that everything associated with the fort is gone and the only thing that remains is what is on top of the hill. None of us have x-ray eyes. We can't see what is beneath the surface. And we know from recent archaeological investigations that things remain. Entrenchments remain that we can't see. Foundations of buildings remain that we can't see. So the fort is really the entire 64 acres and beyond. It stretches beyond what the city currently owns.
Being a descendant of one of the U.S. colored troop soldiers at the fort, it gives me an obligation to tell their story about the 10,133 African American troops who fought in the Battle of Nashville and in the Civil War itself, to always remember the laborers who died building the fort. It was such horrific conditions. Can you imagine starting in August of 1862 in the heat and working into the cold of December, and the incidents that could have happened while building the fort when you think about tragedies that could happen in building. So I think about those who died building the fort. It's very important that they're remembered, as well as those who labored to build the fort, because it was such a horrific conditions in which they lived. Most of them lived in exposure. They died of disease, being exposed to the elements. It's such a tragic story.
One thing I want everybody in this room to know about that fort is that when African Americans arrived in this town, they came to that site. They didn't come to Nashville empty-handed, even though oftentimes most of them only had the clothes on their back. It came as families, as individuals. It came in raggedy wagons, right? But they did not come here empty-handed. They brought their culture, their notions of how they define liberty. And I humbly submit to you that what they brought with them makes the Nashville we see today. I defy anybody in this audience to tell me that Nashville is a music city without taking into consideration the songs that our ancestors brought here, the songs that they might have raised up in the cotton fields, in the tobacco fields, their hope for the future, and how they define liberty, how they define freedom. And from that, I want you to consider that there is a direct line. If you want to talk with me afterwards about this, I probably can convince you in about 5 minutes. There's a direct line between how they looked at liberty and the Nashville movement. They're talking about the same thing. Moreover, the thing and I learned this from some of our civil rights icons. You know, music was very much a part of their movement. It gave them hope for the future. A lot of that music is rooted in the people who came to Fort Negley. So my point, and I want y'all to remember this, that they didn't come here empty-handed. So if we're gonna call Nashville the music city, you gotta consider them. If we're gonna call it the Athens of the South, and I'm mindful, Dr. Busey, that that moniker kind of predates the Civil War, but in reality they were fooling themselves. It would not be the Athens of the South until Fisk shows up, until TSU shows up, until Meharry shows up, which is only about a stone's throw away if you got a good arm for where I'm sitting right now. So they didn't come here empty-handed.
Thanks, everyone. We're all learning, I think, through this master planning process, first of all, just what a master planning process is for a park, and that it's about a lot more than just what you want to see in the park itself. But before you even talk about those things, you have to look at the guiding principles for the process itself. And in the breakout session afterwards, one thing that everyone will be asked is what values or priorities should guide this master planning process. So I submit that question to you all. What do you think are the values and priorities that should guide this process?
I'll get the ball rolling here on this subject. I think it's got to be very inclusive. It's got to include everybody that had any part to do with anything related to that hilltop and the surrounding area that Krista talked about. We've got to be as comprehensive as we can and thoughtful and think about how we can communicate what we see as the importance of this to the rest of the city.
I think the most important thing, and if you spend any amount of time at Fort Negley, you've probably heard Tracy and I say this 100 times, but there's in the entire world, there's only one Fort Negley. Its design is completely unique to the rest of the world, even though it was based on a 17th century design that's pretty common in Europe. It was James St. Clair Morton's own creation. And Fort Negley and everything attached to Fort Negley cannot exist outside of the 64-acre park. Everything else, all of the amenities that may be thrown out there, everything else can exist outside of those boundaries. But we've only got one Fort Negley. And I just want to echo what everyone else has said, that, we can't right the wrongs of the past. We can't make up for the neglect. We can't correct the misinterpretations that have gone on for decades. But we can make an effort to not repeat the mistakes of the past. And we can, as Dr. Busey said, have an inclusive process that is deliberate, thoughtful, inclusive. We need to tell that story that's been neglected for too long.
You have to remember that Fort Negley is a military site, a site of freedom, a site to remember for all ages and all backgrounds. It's not just an African American site, it's a site for all people, all walks of life. I walk at Fort Negley almost daily, and I run into different people and families who walk around the fort. And oftentimes I ask them, do they know the history? And most of them don't know. They just think of it as a recreational park, someplace to walk their dogs or to get exercise. So I try to engage them in conversations about the history of the fort. So when you try to do that, you have to always remember the foundation of a story is about the laborers. We keep going back to the laborers, the 2,771. They must not be forgotten. They cannot be forgotten, and they will not be forgotten. In my poem I wrote called Fort Negley, I use a line talking about that you're in our hands now. Fort Negley is in our hands now, so we have an obligation to make sure that it's passed on to the next generation.
Okay. Thanks to the work of some historians that I see out in the crowd this evening, we now realize that Fort Negley has global significance. But at the end of the day, even though it's important internationally, it's our fort. It belongs at a public site. So in many ways, it should be our story to tell. We think, okay, the world has recognized this fort, but we have something to say about its significance. And in doing so, and this speaks to what my co-panelists have said. There needs to be some diverse voices. There needs to be a diverse way of telling the story, right? We historians have had it for the last 160 some odd years. But it's only been since 1999 when Dr. Lovett published his book that we actually started paying attention to the African American experience there. It's 2021 now, and certainly we've learned a lot more history. So that needs to be incorporated. But one of the things I'm really adamant about is thinking about more creative ways to tell the story so that it isn't forgotten again. I mean, I'm big on books and I love to read, but I envision more creative ways of telling the story. I saw some of Nashville's greatest artists walk in earlier this evening. I'm certain if we push them, they can find a way to illuminate the story that that would put what we historians do to shame, would move people in ways that we cannot. So I think one of the driving factors is diversity, and to think about better, more important ways, or more effective ways rather, to tell the story, be it in word or song. I don't know, we might have some beautiful poets out there in the audience. And I'm not a poet, but I dig poetry, so I would like to hear a poem. We have artists and painters out in the audience, and I see a couple that I really admire right now. Maybe murals and photojournals. So we can, all that is to say, we can do a better job of telling the story than we have in the past.
So I'll take that thought from you, Lee, and run with it a little bit. We've talked a lot about what makes the site unique, the sometimes difficult history of the site that needs to be honored. And yet here we are with this amazing opportunity sitting before us to do all of these things. And so as Dr. Williams was talking about what he would like to see, my question to you is, and this is a little bit off script, but in terms of either educational programs, a type of specific preservation, or a specific type of enhancement, if money were no object, and if you right now got to make one decision about what you think would be an amazing asset in that park, what's your one, like, money is no object, complete dream thing? And that could be, again, it could be a enhancement, it could be something that's preserved. What would it be? Dream big.
I would want a better connection to downtown Nashville, because we do have that barrier of the interstate to get over or under when we get there, and we need to get a better direction coming in from town so that people from the Music City Center could be there. And I've devoted many, many hours to the city cemetery, which is across the railroad tracks, and a way to connect those two historic sites I think would be beneficial to both sites, because there is a connection, because many of the dead from the Battle of Nashville in December of 1864 were their bodies were laid out there, and we need to connect those stories together and connect them with the story of downtown Nashville, rather than having that interstate as our barrier. Krista, I bet, has a big wish list.
I do. I do have a big wish list, but I think the thing that I get excited about most is a Fort Negley themed play space that is inclusive, that families can interact, people can interact, something that would mimic the shape and the construction and the materials of the fort, would include interpretation. It would serve as a family gathering place, but then from the top of the hill, it would also serve as kind of a model of the fort. And this is all backed up by surveys and studies. These play spaces are very popular in Europe. I have an entire PowerPoint presentation. So if you would ever like to see it, I would be ecstatic to share it with you. So I'm just happy to have the opportunity to talk about a Fort Negley play space.
I would speak about something to memorialize the laborers who built the fort. So I would look more into a monument to honor the laborers who built the fort and who died at the fort. I recently, in the past, went to the Wessington Plantation. It's a book by John Baker called The Washingtons of the Wessington Plantation, and he took a tour group out to the site. And where the laborers were buried, they had a pretty large stone with the laborers' names on them to always remember who they were and how they were. And so I would like to see a monument or something at the fort to remember the laborers, and also on a different level to have an annual concert, something to raise money for the fort each year, to have a kind of a designated date to remember the laborers and have families come out and share in the experience of Fort Negley.
Okay. If money were no object, I think my first thing would be to place this fort in the context of a much larger conversation about Nashville. And that would require us to take in consideration every single fort that was built in this city during the Civil War, because they all have something to say, in my humble opinion. I would also like to see an emphasis placed upon education about the fort, with the understanding that we will never know every single thing about that space. So we need to set up things that will enable us to continue studying it, to continue exploring, to continue to develop better questions about the past, with the understanding that the more we learn about Fort Negley, the more insight we get into how we move as people in this city. So that's my thing. I have a young lady that I'm working with on this project. I don't know, Jasmine, are you here? Okay, and I probably shouldn't have called her out like that. But we were going through the census records from 1880 at the Bass Street community. And we're going through it, and if you look at the census, they're just names and so forth. And she was like, Dr. Williams, pay attention to these years. And she saw 1862 and 1863. And she said, I wonder if these children were born at Fort Negley. And that just blew me away, because I had never thought about that. So education would be something that I would emphasize, and the idea that we still have more to learn about the site.
All right, well, we are getting close to time. Thank you all again for all that you do for Fort Negley. If you want to learn more about Fort Negley, please stop by the visitor's office, visitor center at any time, and talk to Krista, talk to Tracy. They would love to talk to you more about about this special place. These folks will be out in the lobby afterwards as well if you wanted to interact or ask some questions. Would you just please give me a hand to thank these folks? So this concludes this part of the program. Now we would just ask if you would move out into the lobby and you get to tell what you think you would like to see at Fort Negley, just like these folks did. So thank you for being here tonight and thank you for your time.